All right. I guess thank you, Taylor, first of all. I was really excited to come out and walk around on stage, but I think I pulled a muscle playing Taylor in ping pong last night. The guy has like a 20-foot wingspan. It's kind of like playing Mr. Fantastic. You're just not going to win that. I'm going to tempt fate, I guess. I really love analogies and tangents. I think they're a great way to explore like a new idea and to relate to new concepts. So in the process of, in the process of making these slides and kind of figuring out a theme, I was reminded of just kind of a subtle difference. And as developers, I figured we'd appreciate this. There's a difference between an initialism and an acronym. And by now, I'm sure all of you all have read this slide, FBI, and that's the point. And the FBI is an initialism. We pronounce the abbreviation by the individual letters. If the FBI were an acronym, which is spoken as a word or a phrase, we might pronounce it Phoebe, which is not at all intimidating like the FBI. So, by the way, I'm JMAC, which is technically an abbreviation since it's, an acronym, since it's an abbreviation of my first and last name. I'm really excited to be here. I attended Laracon for the first time last year. I go to a lot of PHP conferences, but I really feel like Laracon's doing it right, you know? It's just such a great venue, and yeah. It's such a great venue, and on top of which I'm a Louisville native, as you can tell by the t-shirt. I'm that guy, I wore the t-shirt. And I was excited to kind of represent, and I'm also just really, really passionate about this topic, so I'm hoping that shines through the nerves. You guys might have passed this on your way to Starbucks or from the hotel or whatnot, but this is actually our work. It's just directly across the street. We're a product accelerator for Humana, and we're an extreme programming team, and I joined this team about a year ago. And that means that from 8 to 5, we are practicing lean process, we're pair programming, we're TDD, and it's been really interesting to me because I'm somebody who's kind of a searcher. I'm always searching for like something that's going to level up my development skills, something that's going to take me to the next level. And I really feel after working, oh, that's my bike, by the way. So yeah, I really feel like that's Yagni, and so I was excited to share this with you guys, and I hope that you all will be able to take away this practice as kind of cherry picking it out and using it yourself, regardless of if you're agile or extreme programming or whatever you practice. I still think it's something that you can use. So I've broken this talk into 3 parts. These are also kind of filler slides to remind me to get a drink. When you are out till like midnight and drinking bourbon in a loud bar, it's the best way to go through puberty in front of like 400 people. So I'm sorry if I crackle every now and then. So I like to sub-label each one of these sections. So this one is what Yagni solves. Because I think it's really important as you're solving any problem, you have to understand the problem in the first place. And I think we can all agree that we have a problem. It's over-engineering. And I'm not going to belabor this point. I think deep down we all know it. We might not want to admit it. We might want to point fingers. But we'll just use humor and sarcasm because that's always the best. So this is a great XKCD comic. And the guy says, hey, can you pass the salt? And he's waiting and he's waiting. And he's like, I said, and the guy's like, yeah, I heard you. I'm building you a system to pass you arbitrary condiments. And the guy's like, it's been 20 minutes. And he's like, yeah, it'll save you time in the long run. And we do this. It's like, it's funny because we do this, but really it's like, what the fuck? What are we doing? Like, why did we do that? The guy just asked for the salt, and we're building him something that's going to pass him the ketchup and the mustard and the relish and the alfalfa sprouts, and it's like he didn't even ask for the fucking pepper. Like, he just wanted the salt. So why? We know we do this, but why? Why do we do this? And that's really what I wanted to explore. And as another tangent, I actually have a minor in philosophy and psychology, so much like debugging code, I like debugging an idea or an emotion. So I really wanted to take a look at this. And I kind of first thought, okay, well, I'm going to use Aristotle's rhetoric. And kind of like Jack talked about the other day, writing code is much like writing in general. So maybe we're just using the three modes of persuasion of pathos, logos, and ethos. And I already know that I'm losing everybody, and this is not the right approach. So I lightened it up, and I thought, okay, well, maybe we'll just talk about the yin and the yang. It's an easier analogy. We have this whole balancing act of light and dark. It's still a little too deep, and so we're all geeks. Let's just use Star Wars, and like programming's the Force, and if you take it too far, you're Vader. And, just don't do it, right? So I think as programmers, we have two driving forces, right? And the first of which is, on the lighter side, we love what we do, right? We're really passionate about it. You wouldn't be here if you weren't passionate about Laravel or programming, right? And I think we've probably seen this tweet before, but I think it's great. It says, what's your job? Programming. What's your hobby? Programming. What do you think about when you're not programming? Programming. And it's true, right? Like, this is what we do. Like I said earlier, I work 8 hours a day side by side with another dev. Like, we don't take a whole lot of breaks. Like, I'm coding all day long. But as soon as I leave there on the walk to the car, I'm thinking about programming. I'm thinking about what I'm going to work on that night. I'm thinking about, even when I'm watching TV, I'm thinking about how to build an algorithm to better improve Netflix suggestions. Like, this is what we do. Like, we like this. And I think that's great to have that passion, but we can take it too far. And a quick example of that is how many of us have said, like, oh, I can build that in 15 minutes. Like, no problem, right? And it's like 3 days later, and you're still working on the same problem. And it's because of that excitement, again, which is a good thing, but we can take a little too far. I think the other thing that drives us is FOMO, or fear of missing out. And we have severe FOMO as developers. We're like constantly bombarded by all of these abbreviations, and they're just always after us, and everyone's pawning them off as like best practice. This is what you have to do. And I'm sure there's dozens more of these, but you get the point. And we're afraid that if we don't do these things, that our code's not right, or we're not doing something right. And because we care about what we do, because we're passionate about what we do, this plays on our weaknesses. This plays against us. And it's FOMO. I know really everyone at some point was probably checking off in their head, I know this one and that one and this one, and I know you're doing that. I know you're doing that. So that one's bullshit. So don't go rushing out and feeling bad. So just to take this a little bit further, just the other day, this is what I saw on R programming. Looking for CRUD example using OOP solid, unit testing, current best practices, etc. What? Like, what the fuck, driver Dave? Like, it's just CRUD. Just write some CRUD. Like, why do we need OOP and solid and unit testing and all these things you don't even know about? And to that, I'd just say YAGNI. You're not going to need it. So Wikipedia has YAGNI as a acronym, as we've learned about. And as Taylor pointed out, because he's from the South, and technically speaking, Kentucky's the South, as much as Louisville might not want to admit it, you also hear it called "you ain't gonna need it." Sometimes I'll paraphrase and say you're not gonna need it, but that's not even the right acronym. So I go with "you aren't gonna need it." And again, it's something that comes from extreme programming, which basically states that you should not add functionality until deemed necessary. And we're going to break down a few more of these quotes in here because I think they're important, but before moving on from this slide, I just want to point out that initialism. It's huge, and as the creators of YAGNI, someone should have called YAGNI on that because it's like completely over-initialized. So anyways, one of the quotes that we saw from Wikipedia was from Ron Jeffries, who was the co-creator of extreme programming. And basically one of the original kind of concepts before the acronym was coined was that we want to implement things when we actually need them, never just when we foresee we need them. And this is kind of a gray area because as architects of the system, we see the solution before we even start. We think about how we're going to build something before we even write a line of code. And when we do that, we start to blur the lines between need and want. And it's one of those philosophical things, but Yagni can help us figure out the difference between needing and wanting or foreseeing. And we're going to come back to those continually when we get to the code sample part. We've kind of heard this more recently, Yagni being exemplified through MVP, which is also minimum viable product. I think it's really interesting in our industry how terms get recycled. I'd really love to see a lineage of how many things trace back to one original abbreviation, but it's just kind of an interesting thing on mine. But MVP teaches us to make the simplest thing possible. So if we're building a product, again, we can envision the entire product, but it's not something that we necessarily have to build. Maybe there's a smaller piece that we can put in the hands of our customers or our users to determine if we're on the right track. It's not a prototype, but it's the minimum thing that we can build that we feel comfortable putting in the hands of our users. And I think in order to do that, you have to practice Yagni. That really large initialism that we saw a minute ago stands for do the simplest thing that could possibly work. And this comes, again, from Extreme Programming Examined, a really good book talking and outlining about how extreme programming works. But we saw from Adam's talk on TDD the other day, if you guys practice TDD, you're probably really familiar with this. You basically write a really small test, and then you write the minimal amount of code to make that pass. So it's all about doing the simple thing that works, and then just keep doing the simple thing, and again, and again, and again. And that way you're avoiding complexity. That way you're practicing Yagni. And again, we heard this before with KISS, right? Keep it simple, stupid. And it's a cute little acronym, but we don't do this anymore. At some point, we crossed over to the dark side and we didn't even realize. Now we pride ourselves on complexity. We are obsessed with playing design pattern bingo, and we're building ever more intricate architectures in our head of how we're going to build something. And for some reason, that's the whole pat on the head that we get. Somehow simple became stupid, and that's not right. That's not what we're saying here with KISS. And I think we need to figure out a way to reverse that. We need to figure out how to flip that around. And Yagni makes me feel empowered to be able to do that. I'll just quote my boy Anton here and basically say that perfection is attained not when there is nothing more to add, but when there's nothing more to remove. The simplest thing, right? That's potentially perfection, right? Of course we can add a design pattern. Of course we can add more integrations. Of course we can add more features. There's always going to be time for that. But maybe in the beginning, the simplest thing, that's the perfect thing. Part 2. Or as Rasmus once told me, show me the code. All right, so we're going to take a look at a few code samples that's catered to Laravel and just kind of see what it looks like to practice Yagni as you're going through building a Laravel application. So, all right, so let's begin with a really simple start. Namespacing. Namespacing is a really interesting area. It's not uncommon for people to change their namespaces. I'm not going to ask for a show of hand or anything like that, but beyond creating custom namespaces, people also, customizing their app namespace, they also create custom namespaces, two separate things. And this kind of begs the question for me personally, why? Why are we doing this? And normally when I ask myself why and I start thinking about why, that's kind of a little light, the Yagni light in my head starts to go off. I actually have Taylor to back me up here as a personal opinion. He says, don't rename your app namespace, just leave it as app. Convenient and short to type. And that's the whole point, short, convenient, simple. Why are we really changing this in the first place, right? Why are we customizing? And after all, the app folder is there for us to customize with our own application. There's really not much of a need, per se, to customize the actual app namespace. So let's just leave it condensed. Yagni, you're not going to need it. You don't need the customization. It's a real simple thing, but 99% of the time it's true. I can really only think of a few exceptions. First, maybe you're sharing some code, right? Like the custom namespace was there because you share code with another project. But my argument would be maybe there's a different way to do that. Maybe there's a way that's less complex, like a package. The second reason is maybe you're still using 4.2. And it's before namespaces, so you have to create your own custom namespace. And if you're doing that, there's a great little service out there that can help you automate to new versions of Laravel. I know the guy that built it, he got a haircut, but it's still me. So yeah, it's good stuff, and so you don't have any more reasons. So don't customize your app namespaces anymore. So back to some code. Another more common example that we see is routing. So really common and actually out of the box in Laravel, or earlier versions of Laravel, which I'll get to. But you basically have your initial route, and it maps to a controller. And if we look at the controller, the action on there returns a view. But we have to ask ourselves, what's the controller really doing in this case? Why do we need that controller? And if I was practicing Yagni, maybe I don't need the controller in this case. Yesterday we learned about code smells from Sandy, excellent talk, and I'm glad that she covered this so I didn't have to go too far, and maybe I'll have some time at the end for questions. But basically this is lazy class. That controller is a lazy class. When we practice Yagni, we really want to be very strict about this. We want to remember that every time we add a class or an object or any line of code that we add, we're increasing the complexity of our application. We don't want to do that. That's the whole point, right? Our goal is to keep it simple. So Laravel is an MVC framework, and a lot of people have a problem with this sometimes, but just because something's MVC, again, just because something preaches a design pattern doesn't mean that we have to check off all those boxes right away. So really, the controller's not doing anything the router couldn't do in this case. So we just condense it. And in fact, like I said a minute ago, starting in Laravel 5.1, I believe, this was actually what you got out of the box. If you use Lumen, you're actually very familiar with this. If you paid attention in Taylor's talks the other day, this is actually how he wrote most of his code. Now, with respect that that's a demo, you can get pretty far with a router before you need to go and warrant making a controller, adding that complexity. All right, so those examples were pretty straightforward. Let's look at something that's a little more involved. So while Laravel doesn't have the repository pattern right out of the box, it's something I see people use a lot. And my problem is not with the repository pattern. My problem is that when I go and look at the repository pattern, this is what I see. That's a problem. It doesn't seem, again, like this class is holding its weight, right? And so I ask maybe somebody that I'm working with or whatever that had it this way, hey, why did we use the repository there? And they tell me, oh, I saw it on Laracon. And don't get me wrong, Laracon is a wonderful, wonderful resource. I think Jeffrey Way does an excellent job. But I'm sure he would agree that he's not showing you these things just for you to automatically put them into your application. In fact, that's the fun one that Sandy talked about the other day, the speculative generality, right? We're kind of just believing that our code needs this. We're going to put this here because, like, we'll probably use that later. And as she pointed out, this is our biggest sin because we're making assumptions about what we're going to need. And that flies directly in the face of Yagni. Yagni does not allow us to do that. So this code really, in the beginning, should have looked a little more like this. Again, the repository pattern is a great pattern, but until we actually need to make that leap, until we actually warrant that complexity with additional things that it means to get an attendee that maybe go beyond the realm of scope or so forth, that we would want to adopt the repository pattern. It's kind of like not jumping to conclusions, right? This is what it should remind you of. And it's great analogy because basically anytime you encounter a problem, you need to make sure that you can justify the why. Don't just jump from A to Z. There's an importance in understanding the steps in between. There's an importance from going from A to B to C. You don't have to do it every time, but definitely that first time, learn the piece. Don't just take something on face value. All right, let's continue on with the controller example and maybe some subtleties of what Yagni, practicing Yagni actually looks like. So again, the earlier parts were a little bit about taking code away, and that's a bit of a refactor. We have to remember that some of these code samples are showing you going from what it already is to maybe what it should have been, not necessarily going backwards. That's a little bit more refactoring, which I'm going to talk about. So these examples are a little bit more interesting about where Yagni goes kind of the other direction from what we've learned about. So a great example, I think, is validation. So this would be kind of a, if you were practicing Yagni approach, way that you would think, okay, well, I'll just validate in the controller. I don't need, say, for example, a form request object, because as we saw before, we don't necessarily want to take the leap to that extra complexity. The catch here is that we've arguably added complexity to this controller by doing the validation inline here. It would be easier to see if you practice test or we had some tests behind this, but we can imagine that if we had more to validate than just name, that the test for this would now suddenly be these interesting combinations of context. Okay, when name is valid, but email is invalid, and we have to test each one of those scenarios, and running that through this action in the controller would actually be pretty complex. So while the code's maybe not necessarily complex, the test is complex. And that, in its own mind, is another place we would want to practice Yagni. So this is an example where we would actually want to adopt the form request because both of those objects are simple. If we think about testing of the form request object, we're really just testing key values in the array. Super simple test. And now in our controller, we no longer have to have those contextual paths anymore. So while we've made the leap of adding complexity for this new object, we've gained the benefit of doing it, or leaving it out of the controller, which was arguably more complex. And that's one of those subtle differences as you start to practice Yagni that you'll want to figure out. And again, it'd be good to drive it the first way and put it inline until you see the pain. But don't necessarily handicap yourself from using things that are readily available in the framework. Form request object is great. If you would have had to go create your own validation object, like maybe we did in 4.2, that's not something that I would necessarily advocate for. But in 5 and beyond, this form request object makes it super simple, and therefore I don't feel like it's violating Yagni. All right, so one last example to emphasize kind of balancing Yagni. So we all know that certain actions are expensive. Again, we saw in Taylor's demo that as he added more of those notifications that the page kind of got slower and slower and slower. So a real quick example of that is using mail. So this is something that potentially could take a little bit of time and slow down our register request. So again, we might be inclined to say, well, Yagni, like just whatever, just send the mail, and it's not a big deal if it's a few seconds longer. And I think it's really interesting to kind of parallel this with some things we've seen about Pokemon Go lately. I've noticed a lot of articles talking about, well, these services that rely on Pokemon Go, they failed because they were built as an MVP or they were built practicing Yagni. And I think that's misguided because if we look at something like MVP, MVP talks about minimum viable product. Pokemon Go has like a hockey stick of scale, right? I don't think it's very fair to say if we're building a product for a large amount of people that it's viable to only develop it for 10 users when we have 1 million. So I think, again, there's some misconception about the viability of that product. And so Yagni and MVP are not something that necessarily say that you can't build something for scale, that you can just automatically call Yagni on scale. I just don't like that, so minor tangent. But anyways, basically, in this case, we can balance both sides. So we can simply take this and turn it into a job, this send registration email job, and we can dispatch it. But we don't have to necessarily go through the pain of building, a queue server or a job server necessarily. Laravel makes it really simple for us, so we can still practice Yagni by developing for the future, but maybe just in our configuration using the sync driver, right? And waiting for that scale. We don't have to go figure out, Redis, for example, and set up all the servers to do so. Just use sync, and then when we run into the problem, you're able to switch that out with one of the other drivers really simply. One final point, that's not really a code sample, but also calling Yagni really at a high level is maybe in a situation, if you're building an API, for example, maybe you don't need Laravel. Maybe you can just use Lumen, right? It's a little lighter weight, a little less things to get yourself in trouble with, a little less complexity, for example. And that's something that's going to be smaller, and you can call Yagni on. So the final thing I want to talk about, and I kind of briefed over this earlier before we move on to the last part, is refactoring versus Yagni. So some people have a little confusion about this. Some people think that they're necessarily the same thing. Some people think that they're complete opposites of each other. That's not really the case. So let's just balance this out. So we have Yagni and refactoring on one side. The way I look at it is this. If you practice Yagni, I think you're keeping your code simple, right? That's the whole goal of Yagni. Don't add unnecessary complexity until you need it. And so if your code is simple, then your code's going to be easy to refactor, right? And if your code's always in a place where it's easy to refactor, then you're going to be comfortable continuing to call Yagni, right? You're going to be nimble enough to change when you need to. And I think that that creates a nice positive feedback loop. So while they're similar, they're not necessarily the same, and they're definitely not on opposite ends of each other. All right, so part 3, one of my last parts here. I call this the stages of Yagni, or soy. So, because of FOMO, I know hopefully most of you are going to go back to the office on Monday and tell all your coworkers, and you're just immediately going to start practicing Yagni, and you're going to tell everybody about it. And the first stage is going to feel a lot like laziness. Like we talked about earlier, you're going to think, okay, yeah, but like I can foresee that we need to build this feature, but I'm just kind of like skirting around it because Yagni. And that's not really what Yagni is. So we all go through this phase. I remember feeling it in the very beginning when I started working across the street, and I just kind of thought, well, yeah, but we're right here. We're working on this line of code. Like, let's just build this thing. And it's like, yeah, but we don't need it right now. And it was almost infuriating, you know? And it just, to me, again, it felt like laziness. It felt like, why would we do that? You know, let's just build it. We're right here. And there's some tricks for that, which we can talk about in a second. But kind of the thing that started to dawn upon me was that we have time. And I was looking at time the wrong way. Time's kind of tricky. We can look at it 2 ways. We can look at it in a way to stress us out. I don't have enough time. There's a deadline. I got to get this done, right? On the other hand, we can just be like, yeah, I've got time. Like, I'll do that later, you know? No big deal. Real relaxed way to look at it. And that was the whole point. I wanted to start using time on my side, not against me. I can build this later. It's going to be okay. It's actually a really great quote. It's a little long, but I'm going to bear through it. But it comes from Full Stack Radio when Adam interviewed Kent Beck. And again, excellent resource. You guys need to be listening to these things, especially this one and the one by DHH. But anyways, he said he did a little experiment with time, right? And he said, what if he deliberately stopped trying to predict the future? What if he stopped trying to make assumptions about the code that he needed to write, right? And he said things actually got better for him, right? He was actually less stressful. His code was more simple, right? And he was just generally like doing things faster. It's kind of an interesting effect in this little experiment. So he actually started to shorten that timeline. And he was like, well, what about 3 months? And what about 1 month? And what about a week? And he says he never really reached a limit with that experiment. And I think that's fascinating, right? I think it's something to try. Again, try to put time on your side. Do a little game and see, you know what? If I dodge this feature right now, what's going to end up happening? It seems like only good things. Personally, when we're at work, we're working on a feature. Again, we're kind of a lean process, so we work on stories at a time. So just kind of a real-world example is that whenever we're working on a story, even though I know the stories that are coming later, we've already talked about them and pointed them and so forth, I'm aware of them. But that's not what I'm working on right now, okay? It's something that if I feel myself starting to do something to work ahead towards something, I stop. And so that's my timeline. That's my time horizon, is the story. When I'm working on a personal project, my time horizons may be a little bit more about the time I have to work. So, you know, as much as we might want to work on something for a really long time, maybe I only have a few hours a night or just a few hours over a weekend to work on something. So I time box that and say, okay, I'm going to work on these things then. And if it's not one of those agreed upon things where I agreed with myself that that's what I'm working on, I call Yagni on it. I'll do that next time I have time. I think an analogy and a quick way to look at it is water. As human beings, we need water to live, but it's not necessarily when we're thirsty that we need water right away. maybe we're just thirsty because I'm up here talking about water. And it's one of those things where if you try to think about a feature that way, if you try to think about what you're working on and compare it to water, it's one of those things where it's like, well, maybe you kind of start to see that its priority and its urgency fall away. It's like, well, yeah, sure, we're going to need that, but it's not water. Like, we don't need it right now. Like, we're not going to die. So, if that helps. So really, the whole point to get past the whole laziness thing is basically just to challenge your assumptions. If you challenge your assumptions and you ask yourself why, like we looked at with those code samples, I feel like you'll pass that first stage of laziness. You'll get past the whole thing where you feel like you're just kind of skirting the issue because you've realized, you know what, I only had the assumption that I needed to do that thing, but I don't need to do that. So, it's going to be fine. I think some quick ways to do that are just to ask yourself, do you really need to build that right now? And this is what I've been saying for a few minutes, but really right now. Does that really need to happen? Okay, yes, it does. Do you have everything you need to start? This is actually a really important one, right? There's many times where product or a client or somebody tells us, yeah, we need this right away, and you kind of need some data or some information from them, and they haven't given it to you yet, but they need it right now. And so it's one of those things where you might not have everything you need to start. So take a look at that. Do you fully understand the problem? Like I pointed out in the beginning, it's important to understand the problem. If you don't understand the problem, how can you really implement the solution? A little bit of a paradox, I guess, but you need to understand what you're getting ready to work on. You got to have all the pieces, and you need to be ready to work on it right now. And I think if you don't have these things, I think you need to call Yagni and come back to it. All right, the next stage of Yagni. Empowerment. So, Yagni at this stage is basically like just saying no all the time. And I'm probably showing my age here. This is Nancy Reagan's campaign on drugs, just say no. There was maybe I guess 2 people in the audience that get that. I thought it was funny. Anyways, you're just going to feel like Yagni's just, it's gone from lazy and now you're kind of empowered and you're doing it and you're practicing Yagni, and really what you're doing is feeling like you're just saying no all the time. It's like, hey, are you going to build that one feature right now? No. It's like, okay, well, that's not so much fun, And it's because saying no is empowering, and that's kind of what it's going to feel like, but they're not really one and the same thing. And if you end up just saying no to everything, you've really just kind of gone to the dark side. That's not where Yagni is supposed to take us. And so it's one of these things where you're going to reach a point where you're probably going to have to call Yagni on Yagni. And so I brought in Exhibit to explain this for us, but we know that you like Yagni, but we're going to call Yagni on your Yagni so you can practice Yagni while you Yagni. So it's one of those things, again, where you just can't say no to everything. That's not what Yagni is. It's a common misconception, and people feel like, oh, yeah, this is great. I'm just going to say no all the time. And sometimes it works, and yeah, that's great, but that's not what it's about. And so how will you know the difference? And so I think there's a couple more heuristics we can look at for this. So don't call Yagni when you're learning something new. It's easy to feel like you're wasting time when you're trying to figure out a new way to work on something. But like I've been talking about all along, if you don't understand the problem, how can you understand the solution? So if you're learning something brand new, don't call Yagni on that. Take the extra time to read the documentation. Take the extra time to find a few other packages and compare their features. Because this is going to save you time in the long run, trust me. I found this out the hard way by kind of trying to call Yagni on these things. Whatever, man, let's just use this package, Yagni, let's go. And it's not a good idea. It pays dividends to, continue learning something and spending that extra time for it. The next thing not to call Yagni on is a current design decision based on a future need. And I think this is something that kind of goes back to the queue example that we looked at earlier, if we can remember that. Basically, we don't want to handicap ourselves, right? We don't want to make that mail in line like that and not have the potential to queue it and scale later just because scale is not something we need right now. So it's a perfect example of this. It sounds interesting, but once you do it a few times, you'll understand. You can't just say, oh, well, I'm going to intentionally build this the wrong way because I don't really need all those other features right now. you shouldn't be building things poorly and claiming it's Yagni. That's not necessarily the approach. Testing. You cannot call Yagni on testing. I know people want to do this, but you can't. Similar to like the whole design decision bit, it's always going to be better to have that extra test. The whole point of testing and TDD and how to know when you're done with TDD is that you don't feel like you can break it anymore. If you can think of a way to break your code, you need to write the test for that. So don't call Yagni on a test just because you think, oh, well, you know what, like I've pretty much covered it over here, and yeah, that might be an edge case, but like I'm not going to worry about it right now. Definitely don't call Yagni on testing. Abstracting external code. This one's a little interesting because it might seem like writing these extra, adapters or wrappers for this external code that you're going to use, you should call Yagni on. It's extra, complexity, right? It's these extra classes. But they have justification. Their justification is that they are creating a barrier between your code and their code, right? If you practice Yagni and you only built this adapter over time, what you would end up with is a situation where you have to go back later and all those little things that you built continue to update the code. So you kind of put yourself in this downward spiral of like, okay, I wrote an abstracted method A, but I don't need to abstract method B right now, I'll do that later. But then you skipped over all this code, and then finally when you go and abstract method B, then you got to go back to all that code that you skipped over and put in A. And so it's just this vicious cycle. So don't call Yagni on extracting external code. And finally, business requirements. Again, as much as we might want to say no to product and business, if someone is unfortunately, if your enterprise, like mine, unfortunately, for example, says that we can't use PHP, then guess what? Unfortunately, I can't use PHP. If they say that you have to use, Microsoft SQL Server or something else, it's one of these things where that's a business requirement and you can't be like, yeah, we don't need that, like we're going to use this other thing. It's just the hard facts. So unfortunately, cannot call Yagni on business requirements. The final stage of Yagni is confidence, right? You've figured out, okay, well, I'm not really being lazy, and I'm not just saying no all the time. And you've suddenly become confident. I would imagine it's a little bit like Jon Snow, like just being comfortable being Jon Snow. Even given the fact that like you know nothing, like it's something that it's something that you could be comfortable with. In a way, there's, ignorance is bliss. Like that might be good. Like not knowing what the next feature is going to require me to build might be okay. Again, it might be less stressful. What's really going to be wrong with that? Maybe there's, maybe it's good to be Jon Snow. I don't know. I really think with Yagni that you're going to know when to defer decisions until tomorrow, right? This is critical. This is critical for that whole confidence and kind of that ease of mind. When I'm bombarded with all of those abbreviations and people telling me, you should do this, and you should do that, and you should look into this, if I'm practicing Yagni and I'm confident doing that, then I'm comfortable knowing that it's like, yeah, that sounds great. I'm going to listen. I'm going to learn about that new thing. But you know what? I'm going to keep it in my back pocket, and I'm going to maybe implement that tomorrow. I think when you become confident and able to do that with Yagni, you're also going to be able to start trusting your ability to pivot. Again, we kind of saw this with that positive feedback loop between Yagni and refactoring. It's one of those things that if I can change rapidly, if I'm nimble and agile, then it's not a big deal if I actually make a mistake. If I actually kind of prematurely call Yagni on something, it's not a big deal because after all, I didn't even write the code for it, so I'll just write that code later. It's not a big deal. I'm confident in my ability to change. You're also writing less code. This is great because the best code is no code. And if you're not writing code, then you don't have anything to worry about. But even if you are writing code, I feel like the code that you're writing is less complex. And that's the whole point for me. That's what Yagni is really about. I really feel better about my code. It's not bloated with extra things that I don't maybe quite understand yet or I don't feel like I need yet. It still has interesting patterns inside of it. It's still fun. I still am very proud of my code. But it's just something that, you know what? It's simple. And I'm entirely confident in that. And I think that it's great. And I think what gets us there, again, is Yagni. You aren't going to need it. So I think I have, it was a little quick there. That's good though, because I wanted to take some questions. So I don't know, can't really see everybody, but maybe we have five minutes or so for questions. Great, thank you. Anybody have any questions about Yagni? Any challenges of like, hey, I'm building this and, you know, I can't call Yagni on that.
Don't call Yagni on security features.
Oh, there you go. That's another good one. Don't call Yagni on security features. Thank you, Chuck. Yeah.
So sometimes you get the combo where you're thinking Yagni on this, and the other person that you're working with thinks it's important to create and why it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so you want to practice Yagni, and you think you can call Yagni, but your coworker or pair or whatever says, well, you know, like, I think we need this, but I just can't put my finger on why. I think the obvious answer to me is you take a few minutes and explore it, right? So normally what I do with my pair, if he feels that way, we'll time box it to 5 minutes, and we'll talk it out. And maybe we'll do some Google searches together. Like, I'm not gonna leave it on him just to tell me why, you know? Like, don't put him in the box like that. Like, that's tough, you know? Don't put the pressure on him. Do some Google, searches. See if you can find a Stack Overflow example of code or something where somebody, used this or try to do the same thing. But the trick there is that if you can't come up with something in a few minutes, by looking at it together, then maybe you went out with the Yagni bit, right? And maybe they're gonna feel more comfortable too because you spent some time to look for it. Another quick trick is if they still won't let it go, what I do is I'll put a to-do comment in the code. I normally don't like code comments, but I think that's an exception where we say, look, let's come back and revisit this here later because of whatever your pair was kind of worried about. And then if you do come back to it, after calling Yagni a few days later and you actually need it, then your buddy can say, I told you so, and he feels good. Any other questions? Tough to see.
Do you find yourself building in more time for intentional refactoring later when you're doing this?
No, a lot of the times, for me, refactoring is part of the story. And if I've practiced Yagni, along the way, like we saw with kind of that positive feedback loop, it's something where the code's really simple to change. And at that point in time, you're gonna have a much better understanding of the change you need to make. And so refactoring's not taking as long to do as it might have earlier when you didn't really fully understand it. And that's kind of what I'm trying to talk about, again, using that repository pattern. Nothing at all wrong with the repository pattern, but make sure you understand its need. Because when you understand its need, you're gonna be able to wield it a lot better, right? It's the force thing. So, maybe one last question if someone's got one, if not. Okay, well, hold on. Yep, all right, so there you go. Talk to you later. I'm Gone Dark on Twitter. I'm a little old school, so please feel free to just email me. And I know we have a talk right after this, but I would love to hear more about your challenges or questions even about Shift or just in general. So catch me in the next break or at the final after party. So thank you.